Okay, welcome to Community Health 410, Trauma as a Community Health Issue. This is discussion number 4. And welcome to Morgan Vanderpool. We're super excited to have you. I'll give a small introduction that Morgan is a community mental health practitioner in Tacoma area and does a lot of work as in mental health, in education, if I'm correct, and different types of settings. And we're super lucky to have them. And maybe we can do our introductions of whoever's here and then get into this conversation. And if you want to say anything else, Morgan, that I left out about specifically your work, but we'll also go into that in a second. Please feel free, and I'll turn it over to you to also tell us what you want to know about us in the introduction.
Ooh, cool. So Brenda, and is that how I can address you here? Okay. We connected around public health work, anti-violence work here in the community. I've been in Tacoma for about 12 years working specifically with supporting folks and organizations to better understand the impacts of complex trauma and what that means to heal using our bodies and our breath and our movement as our focal points for tools for resolution, and kind of how that plays out in care provision and organizational structure, all that jazz. So trauma is my gig, and just kind of like a heads up from the beginning. I can easily talk about things that most people have been silenced about for a long time, communities and individuals. So at any point, if you want me to either slow down through something that I'm used to talking through, or I am kind of leaning into too much detail for your own survivorship and for your own sense of staying connected to this conversation, like we can gas and brakes together as we talk. So yeah, and right now I'm in Hilltop, just so y'all know like where in Tacoma I'm at. Oop, I think you're on mute. Thank you. I would love to know your name, the pronouns you use, and maybe like one curiosity you're already sitting with before we start this conversation.
Okay, my name is Lynn. I'm part of the community health program, and my pronouns are her, them, and what was the last question?
If you have a curiosity that's on top that you want to voice before we get started.
I have some experience in working with victims of trauma, or people, or survivors of trauma is what I would say. How do you develop that resiliency? Is it a conscious thing, or is it something that just comes progressively through your work?
As a provider, or?
Yes, as a provider, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, Lynn. Welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, my name Marcus. Pronouns him, he, him, they, us, we. No, just kidding. I'm also in the community health program, and Morgan, I work closely with homeless population, with Catholic Community Services and Tacoma Rescue Mission, and I've seen a whole lot of trauma that is beyond the belief for the normal eye. My concern there with you being in this for like what 12 years, Dylan, that there's a big need for that in just Tacoma alone. Do you see anything that is forming to address that? Because I think that's like really needed in the homeless population here.
Agreed. Thank you for being here, Marcus.
Welcome. Thank you.
Any curiosity you got? Cool. Yeah, I can take a download. Okay, I'm ready. Mm. And also too, Brenda, if you notice that any of the content of these curiosities are going to get answered by questions you already have, you could probably read them with that filter. Yeah. It's epic. I'm in it. Mm-hmm.
Trauma, do individuals feel the need to place blame on women? And I'm assuming she shared a whole story about her own experience with MST. And I won't read the whole thing here, but I'll just shared that she went through that and found that in her own experience, the blame was placed on her as a survivor. And it's in her experience, it's often placed on women who are survivors. And why is that so? And we have a question from Kylie. Is there a higher, I guess the question, I don't fully understand the question, but is there a higher estimated percentage of sexual trauma among LGBTQ community? Which is the gist of the question. And how can we, this question from Shanae, how can we change a system that has latched itself onto our youth? So like focusing on youth and, you know, rape culture and things like that, and how like the way that media is focused on selling this kind of imagery or culture to youth. And yeah, there's a lot here. Question from Hannah. The Me Too movement has forced communities, workplaces, and universities to evaluate sexual misconduct. How can I start broadening the conversation and consider the different classes, races, age groups, and people with sexual and gender identities? So kind of the intersections of that. And then Alex's question. He wants to know why males are always blamed in court for every mishap that happens to women. And I suppose that's in a male-female dynamic. And so that was his question. And so this is what I'll start with as student questions. And we can always, I can read those again. But to start off, before we even get into that, is welcome, and please will you tell us about your current work, what you do, your focus of your treatment, and things like that.
Yeah. I'm curious if there's space in here to do maybe like a 1 or 2 minute like breath or movement practice as a way to start, so I can gain my voice and
Definitely.
sort of distill what we just heard from y'all. So you're welcome to participate in whatever way feels helpful to you. I'm thinking like 1 or 2 minutes of noticing your breath and moving if you want to. You're welcome to keep your video on or turn it off if you're live. So in whatever way feels helpful to you, and I'll be practicing along with you, maybe noticing the parts of your body that are in contact with the floor or your chair or whatever you might be seated upon. And in your own way, noticing if there's any small movement that would be helpful for you to experiment with, maybe movement through your shoulders, maybe a sway through your head, possibly a shift in your seat. Or maybe taking a few moments to kind of notice if there is a way that you want to choose to breathe right now that feels supportive to you. Through nose, mouth, and whatever depth, race, or pace feels helpful to you. And maybe taking a moment in your own way to say thank you to yourself for showing up to this conversation. Saying thank you to yourself for every choice that you've made to be able to be present right now. And offering gratitude to any other source of support that you know that you have in this moment, whether it be ancestors, family, environment, whatever you call on for support. And from me to you, a huge, huge, huge thank you for being here. This conversation will honor, this is a phrase I use, take it or leave it, the badassery of your survivorship and the survivorship of every survivor you've ever known or will get to meet. And I will say this for inclusivity to whatever the density of your survivorship might be, like, we are all some badass survivors, and thank you so much for having this conversation together, because we're here. So I'm a pretty informal facilitator. I speak in circles sometimes. I also have a shit ton of energy, and so I can kind of like blast off and go real fast. So I will try to pace myself and use y'all's, at least the folks who are here, a little bit of your body language as resonance on whether or not we're pacing together. So let's see. My name is Morgan Lee Vanderpool. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as a queer, non-binary, fun, fascinating human. I understand the world through my body, through movement, through breath, through sensation. And then I like try to figure out what the fuck I'm feeling and why I'm feeling it. And I also swear a lot. So if that's interruptive to your learning process, please like give me a little time out or a pause. My sort of development as a human, I'm really grateful, has been across borders and across language for a long time. I've spent a lot of my life south of the US border in Mexico, Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And so I use that cross-border understanding of the implications of systems of violence as a way to ground how I understand how bodies are impacted by different forms of violence. And I also use the point of reference of me and my own intersectional positionality of who I am, both in my recovery from having recognized that a lot of my positions of privilege have probably led me to cause harm unintentionally. And also my survivorship carries a really cool wisdom that I'm now like melding them together to bring the wisdom that I can to this work. I started social work in some way, shape, or form in a professional sense since I was about 22. I'm 35 now. And I jumped feet first into being of service in the foster care system. I was living in San Diego at the time, and I was working across borders between San Diego and Tijuana with kiddos between the ages of 0 and 5 that had been removed from their home. So real quick, at the age of 22, professionally, was exposed to some of the most vulnerable little bodies and being exposed to the most highest extents of violence. And I had to come to some sort of reconciliation around that. So I think that plus my own survivorship as a kid brought me to this constant curiosity and question is like, what are we doing to actually attend to the intensity of trauma that we're surviving as humans? And I kept on working with organizations that were saying that they were being of service of, and it was mostly just kind of like creating programs and structures and band-aids to like try to keep people safe, but not necessarily attending to the wounds of the impacts of systems of oppression on our body. So like I said, I understand the world through movement. I've been a dancer my whole life. And I started practicing what is called yoga in the West at the age of like 18, and have sort of braided my understanding and fascination with like neurobiology and the ways that our brains and our bodies tick, along with movement and breath, kind of the whole time, which has led me to now practicing in Tacoma with folks who are explicitly looking for nervous system restoration as a way of being able to heal from the impacts of complex trauma. I primarily work in my queer and gender nonconforming community. I do a lot of works with folks that are moving through the medical transition or the internal transition of understanding what it means to be transgendered. And I have a beautiful opportunity to continue to work cross-linguistically with folks who speak Spanish at different levels of arrival to the United States. And I get the opportunity as well to co-educate fellow professionals around the body-based understandings of trauma, because a lot of times that stuff's left out of any healthcare training. It is left out, this is, you know, I'll stand on my own soapbox here, for the same reasons that the violence happens, that the systems themselves would have to then own their relationship with systems of oppression if they actually paid attention to the fact that trauma is at the origin of most things that we're trying to heal as a healthcare system. So might have taken a little bit of a tangent. We're coming back. And so I get to offer courses at lots of different organizations, to boards, to fellow healthcare providers of all different kinds of sorts, around what are the neurological implications of complex trauma and our own survivorship, and how does that play out in our relationship with our own nervous system, our brain function, ourselves, the way we feel ourselves, and the folks that we get to work with. And leaning into the absolute brilliant adaptability of our nervous system that we have the opportunity to wire for connection and wired for sense collaboration. And that takes a lot of work because our bodies are built for survival. So yeah. And I also kind of want to name in my own way that we're at this moment in history doing a little bit of acknowledgement of this point of history, that at least in the United States, we have arrived here after multiple hundreds of years of a history of violent colonialism, genocide, slavery, and commodification of Mother Nature and human bodies. That has led us to this very complex point of revolution and evolution as a species. And we have a lot of really vital choices to make about how to honor our survivorship and move forward. So grateful to understanding the history of the land that I stand on and trying to be in right relationship with that moving forward. So, hey, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was actually something that I don't think we covered enough in our last week's discussion, which was about American Indian and Alaska Native trauma, historical trauma, community trauma, intergenerational, like about land acknowledgement. But I thank you for doing that and acknowledging the trauma that happened here before this society that we have here now exists, and maybe the ones that are continuing to happen also. And so maybe I'll bring that into the next question, which is, what have you learned about being trauma informed as it's emerged from your own professional experience? And we have talked about it a little bit. We've reviewed the CDC framework of being trauma informed and a few like typical kind of, meanings of it, but like, what is your meaning from your own experience?
Well, like, how would I define what it means to be trauma informed?
Exactly, and how it's come out from your own work.
Okay. I'm gonna move something on the floor, hang on. Okay, so so there's this interesting kind of like scale between being trauma informed and being able to maintain trauma sensitive relationships. And so what I've kind of noticed is that in how healthcare is kind of tackling being in relationship with trauma, we've had to move in a very cognitive way because we live in a cognitive society where folks like to learn things in the brain, download information, and with that new information, hopefully make new choices. And the interesting part and the beautiful part and the challenging part about our universal survivorship of trauma is that it is 100% stored and held and communicated body to body. And so for me, trauma informed speaks to learning the information that you need to learn. Like, you need to learn like the difference between your autonomic and like learn your autonomic nervous system, your system of survival, learn about all of the like facts of who experiences what density of survivorship. There's some information you need to download, but the most important work is figuring out how your body has survived what you've survived and your relationship with other folks' survivorship. And so to me, trauma sensitive is the direction, and like those words still sort of feel incomplete because trauma sensitive also means anti-oppressive, because trauma is the impact of interlocking systems of oppression. So the scope of trauma informed or trauma sensitivity that I'm trying to encourage within healthcare and the cross conversations that I have with my fellow professionals is to continually lead us to creating a trauma sensitive relationship with our own bodies and being able to have a trauma sensitive relationship with the bodies that we have the privilege of working with, whether we call them client or colleague, because survivorship is universal. And there's different ways that certain forms of survivorship have been shamed. So like the way that somebody survives sexism, and how sexism and patriarchy and misogyny kind of co-multiply to create the opportunity for us to have things like toxic masculinity or different like environmental factors that might cause sexual assault. But each of our bodies has survived patriarchy somehow. Each of our bodies has survived misogyny somehow because it's out there. Each of our bodies have survived racism somehow, all from our unique positionality. And our body tells that story. It helps us understand when we encountered the moments in which we felt that a piece of us was no longer safe to be. And that somebody could take power over a piece of us just because of who we are, the size of our body, the color of our skin, the age we might be. And so trauma sensitivity to me means figuring out how to move and breathe in a trauma sensitive way with each other, based off of all that cool shit that you need to learn up here. But at first, and we'll talk about, I imagine we're going to get into how your nervous system actually fires, and like the big base piece that I want you all to kind of like hold as a beginning thought, is that most of our systems that help us have a felt sense of safety or ease or capacity to connect and collaborate, because we might not always feel safe, but we can lead into connection and collaboration. Most of those systems run primarily body brain. So your brain is a bit more like a filter for how your body's feeling when it comes to conversations about trauma. And a little caveat that I recognize I didn't say at the beginning, when we talk about trauma, there's no way you're not going to be feeling it in your body. So as we're having this conversation together, and I'm going to say the word trauma pretty often, I'm going to say the words oppression pretty often, and I'm going to be pretty specific about what I'm talking about around like body sensations and all that kind of stuff. So make sure you move, make sure you drink your water. Like if you need to take a break and get some fresh air, like please do. Because there's no way we can have this conversation without lighting up our survival systems. And remember that when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody who's like, I want to be trauma informed, but they really don't want to feel anything.
Thank you. That's a really good point. I would love to just keep going on that train of what you were just talking about and move into like the frameworks or ideas or theories that have been useful to you in your practice. And, you know, like, especially we haven't talked much about neurobiology and nervous system. So if you want to share anything about that, we've heard a little bit. In week 2, we listened to a podcast by Resmaa Menakem. And so we know a little bit about this, but more that you want to say is totally helpful.
Alrighty, so like theories, frameworks, to start describing that. All right. So, So the interaction between our autonomic nervous system and our vagus nerve and our breath muscles and certain key parts in the brain are my main map. And each of those pieces has a really cool conversation that helps me be able to kind of create a structure to try to like clearly understand things that we have been trained to try to like keep separate in, oh, that's biology, that's cognitive science, that's sociology, that's psychology, that's your mind, that's your body. All of these things that have been sort of like separate. My aim is to create a map where it all comes together, but not so overwhelming that we can't pay attention to it. So our bodies are built for survival. And what that means to me is that our body, and what I've learned is that our body is constantly trying to suss out whether it's okay, not okay, safe, unsafe, well, unwell, seen, unseen, heard, unheard, validated, invalidated. Like every single microsecond, we're trying to figure out if we can still exist. So we're primed for that. And so there are 5 main ways in which our body responds to a felt sense of threat. And we'll respond to a felt sense of threat when we can suss out from our environment, from things we can see, smell, hear, all of that kind of like externally measure. If we sense a threat from our environment against our own body's integrity and safety, we're gonna be real good to pick up on it. The part of the conversation within survivorship that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much is that we will also have those same survival reactions from an internal sensation. Our body's picking up on heart rate, breath rate, muscular tension, posture, tone of voice. All of these things are building blocks for our body to go, okay, I may be okay or I may not be okay. So external threat we can measure, internal sense of threat that our body gives us a signal for. There's also this interesting place in the middle where if we can have a felt sense that a piece of our identity is being questioned or invalidated or unseen, this survival system will also engage. And we respond in a few different ways. Our bodies are first trained to try to lean in to try to find connection. So we'll do this, we'll come in and we'll read a room and we'll figure out which bodies start to sort of like vibe up with ours, and could I see myself feeling like okay and safe with them based off of the way that we're looking at each other, the way that we're breathing around each other, physical distance we're taking, signals we might throw each other. We're looking for signs, right, of being able to be like, okay, I'm good. If our body can't find that somehow, then the next 2 that our body sort of triage with is to either fight off the thing that feels threatening or to get the fuck away from it. So we'll either fight or we'll flee. We'll also do this with our mind. If our body can't do it, then we'll do it in our mind as well. We'll resist, we'll defend, we'll like get frustrated, we'll get angry, like, or we'll be like, not talking about that, not thinking about that, bye. The other 3 are the ones that don't get as much like highlight as to how we survive things. And those 3 are freeze, submit, and fawn. So freeze, pretty concrete, but it's also really debilitating sometimes when you wish you could move, but you can't move when you're under threat. And these last 3 are, because they don't get talked about as much, and also we don't necessarily get to do the action which we could have in the midst of threat, these last 3 tend to carry a little bit more shame. So it's kind of leaning into y'all's shame narrative. And understanding that role and how we feel it in our body. And so freeze, we lock up, we get heavy, can't move, can't speak. Freeze prolonged tends to start to feel like chronic depression. And so if you wake up every morning and kind of suss out that your environment is not safe most of the time, it's really natural for your body to just depress and stay still. So the other 2, submit and fawn. Submit means to kind of like go along to get along, might be a phrase that you might use. It happens on a really like instantaneous visceral level, like in car accidents a lot. We'll like through a car accident. And it's our body's way of like moving with the thing that could be life-threatening, and it helps us survive. We also do that relationally too. We'll follow along with the behavior or the thought processes of the system or the person that is in power. And so we'll kind of go along to get along. A major role when we're talking about interpersonal violence and living with the person that, or working with the person that is creating a context of threat. The last is fawn. It's also one of the most confusing too. Is fawn means that we end up sort of like mimicking the thought processes, the verbalizations, the actions, the behavior of the person that we find threatening. So it's a way of kind of like getting close to your frenemies, your enemies, to make sure you're sort of in close graces. Or you'll start to behave like them because your body senses that behavior keeps you safe or gives you power. That framework alone, being able to normalize the way that our bodies, without us choosing, this is completely a body response, how we get through shit, is a major framework for me to normalize and not pathologize survivorship. both for myself and times in which my body did something that didn't make sense, or for folks that I might have the opportunity of working with, so that we can release expectations that we're supposed to face threats all the same way. And threats are also challenges, threats are also changes. And so even when we're leaning into doing something like that we know we want to, these survival responses will also happen because we're like, is it gonna be okay? So right now with like the global revolution and a global pandemic, everybody's in these responses right now because shit's real and we don't know what tomorrow is gonna be like any day. So also having compassion for us collectively right now that we're moving and breathing in a way that are kind of like perpetuating these survival responses. And they have some chain reactions in our brain, which I'm gonna kind of just like check back in with you, Brenda, around like, I know I just gave a big download and we can pause there. Or if we want to talk about the brain pieces a little bit.
Yes, that was really helpful. It's a different way of that we've been talking about trauma so far in the class. We've been kind of at the bird's eye view, and then this module that we're getting into right now is hopefully going to go deeper. So what you're telling us about is perfect and taking us deeper into survivorship and the whole like somatic process of that is really helpful. So thank you, and whatever you want to share additionally is welcome.
Lynn, you got something?
Yeah, I had a question. At what point would you say survivors where you have depersonalization and or a psychotic break? From extended or experience.
Yeah, I'm following you. So I think what you're speaking to is, how do I want to land your question? Is that there's a huge diversity of survivorship, and the diversity of our survivorship is made more intense by the number of systems of oppression that we face on a day-to-day basis,
right,
and made more intense by the frequency, the chronicity, the proximity, like how close is the violence to me, who is it being instigated by, the age in which I experience it, what other factor would I include? Those are coming to the top of my head right now. And so when you start to like multiply those impacts, our nervous system continues to try to pattern for our own survival.
Right.
And so the two things that you sort of explained around depersonalization or a psychotic break are ways in which when we get to some of those max points that our body continues to try to adapt.
Right.
Depersonalization is based off of like the sensations in my body are so intolerable that I gotta separate. I am now separate, or I'm divided.
Right.
Yeah. Or I'm divided into multiple identities neurologically to be able to try to like hold my experience. So dissociative identity disorder. I won't call it a disorder, actually. Creating dissociative identities for survivorship.
Right.
Creating a whole team inside. And then psychotic break, I would, like my body goes like this to it around calling it psychotic.
Right.
And I think there's also another point where we reach our max point and our body creates different realities to be able to live within. And it's really scary when it does that, because like we get launched into realities that are also unfamiliar. So we're living in unfamiliar realities that may be ours that we created. And also they still feel very scary because our body still feels scared, because the like core reason that I made those splits probably hasn't disappeared.
So it's still a form of survivorship. It's just, I mean, the frame of reference is one that I would acclimated to in forensic mental health. So that is a terminology that got thrown around a lot. But so I was just, yeah, okay. That makes sense. It still is a form of survival, because I see almost everyone finds a way back once they feel it's safe. It's just finding your journey back. Yeah.
Safe enough. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I got a question.
Yeah, what's up, Marcus?
On the freeze and the get along phase and the funding, all those three there. So I found it. I'm just trying to connect. People can be stuck. We can get stuck in those for years, right? And every time we just go out in public and okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Very
These are natural. Oh, sorry for interrupting you.
Oh no, you're good. That's just it. Just made me connect some more things there. Go a little deeper with the.
And you can go real deep with this stuff. I've shocked myself while teaching it, thinking I've already processed all my shit, and my whole body takes me to this like other time in which my body did that thing to get through the thing, and I'm like, ah,
Yeah.
God damn.
Yeah.
Ow. Or we like, then, you know, this stuff plays really big into doing our intergenerational work, right? Where we may have seen behaviors in our like grandparents, great grandparents, parents, and we're like, why the fuck did they do that? Like, why couldn't they do X, Y, and Z? Or why did they do X, Y, and Z? And you start to paint it through a survival response.
Okay.
For me, it has generated so much compassion because these survival responses in our body are so strong and they're so ready to protect us that they're really hard to say, don't do that, because our body's like, what? No, I'm going to do the thing that keeps you alive. I'm going to keep doing it. So we're creating, like the solution to that is creating opportunities to live into other felt sensations that we're choosing to kind of give encouragement to. Thank you so much for doing everything that you did for me. And I will use you whenever I need to, but we don't have to be in 100% relationship all the time. And so it's interesting oscillation, because trying to mute all of this stuff is not going to happen, especially with the like visibility and like acuteness of like the environmental stuff that we're consistently inundated with now. There's no way to like, not no way, but it's a lot harder to like move away from the stimulus or stimuli that our body is reacting to, because of the heightened visibility of violence because of technology. I think I did a sidestep. But I'll come back.
That was awesome. I think what you were talking about was really helpful. And if you had any particular, like everything you said in itself sounds like a framework, but if you had to put a name on it, is there one that we could, because what I'm planning to do towards the end of our class or somewhere soon is post up a lot of these things that our speakers are talking about so that students can take it with them, use it for their final projects, things like that. So if you had to name it something, is there a name, or if not, you know, what would you call this kind of framework that you're coming from?
This is a good question.
Would you call it somatic therapy?
I don't think so. As like an overarching name, I would probably say something like intersectional neuroscience of complex trauma. So grounded in an intersectional understanding of systems of oppression and how our nervous system survives it, and figuring out what that conversation is. And so some things that I'm pulling from are the polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges, as far as the body-brain conversation. Granted, some of the challenging pieces around trauma work, including the book, The Body Keeps the Score, are written by folks that are ambivalent about the Me Too movement. Can't say what their relationship is with racism or their understanding of it, and continue to perpetuate a lot of the like interesting power structures that are inherent in academia. And I say this from having met them in person. And so we have to read, especially white cis het guys with power who have been able to get published. We have to read their work with an intersectional lens.
Can we just deconstruct that title for a second in case there's anyone who's not familiar?
Which one?
The white cis het.
Oh, thank you. So white passing or white identifying cisgendered heterosexual male, the folks who have been allocated the most power within our system.
Right.
And
I've
if you've
never
ever taken chemistry, there's cis and trans. So cis is someone who their gender lines up with assigned birth at sex, or is that how you would identify that?
That their assigned birth at sex lines up with the gender ideas that are matched with those body parts.
Right.
Thank you for breaking that down, just in case.
Appreciate it. That was exactly what I was asking for.
Well, Marcus,
when we're
did you have a oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry. Me? Who?
Did you have a question, Marcus?
Well, I wanted looking at this here and your breakdown of it. I think it's just like fight or flight mode is just like basic now. There's a lot of other things going on under that. That's not being addressed. And you mentioned it earlier how the healthcare system, how a person coming there experiencing trauma, whatever, car wreck or whatever, they address the physical part, but nobody wanna deal, whether it be, I don't know, lack of training or lack of education. This whole side is being ignored. And things, like you said, things have changed so much from 200 years ago. And I'm learning like models throughout on the East Coast, and then they're trying to practice out here the multidisciplinary teams where they treat the whole person mentally, physically. Why we continue in the system so important where we got so much of this happening in our own community, sticking to old practices, and we're not being proactive, we're just being reactive. And by the time we react to this, it's going to be 30 years where 80 more different things occur where we haven't dealt with.
I agree with your observations. Do you all have an echo from me? Or is that just in my own ears?
A little bit.
A little bit? Did
Not
it clear
too
up? So I'm going to jump a little bit, Marcus, because of your question, but I think it plays into what we're talking about for sure. So I'm going to go a little out and I'll come back in and we can talk about brain structure and stuff. So we're all learning, like within your program and any healthcare professional, the system as it is right now is built off of profitability. It's built off of profitability of survivorship.
I agree.
So it's like the system at its very inception, like Western healthcare, has been created from being able to make money off of the ways that our bodies survive violence without making sure that the violence stops. And so what we're looking at is figuring out how to create a shift within a healthcare system that is inspired by capitalism and has roots in creating itself based off of experiments with humans that were considered other because of however their body showed up based off of the amount of melanin they had or the way that they might have shown up with their sexual organs, etc. So if a system's built on that history, we are at a place of trying to create a whole different system, whether it's from the inside or whether we tumble it and create a new one, where our profitability is off of wellness rather than pathology. And that's, I think it's happening. And also we got a shit ton more work to do. So I think that's probably why I was drawn to social work rather than like just mental health, because I really wanted to understand how the whole system worked. And where does funding come from? How does funding inform decisions? And how does leadership create organizations that are really actually of service? And like, how do we make that happen? So we need to create contexts in which whatever we define as profitability is coming off of actual wellness that's attending to the roots of trauma. So I agree with you, and like it's like whatever piece of the puzzle you can work on to make that happen, we all got to start like worker being it.
Well, just working in studying with Brenda and the stuff I'm learning, it's like before this, I got to see a lot of broken stuff out there, and right now going forward, I'm just trying to. I don't know. I just feel like it's my role as a community health provider, somehow with this background, to build better systems in just the community. That's where I'm at. That's why I'm asking these questions, because my brain turning and what you're showing me, it's missing even in just St. Joseph Hospital, or you know what I mean? And then all nonprofit, it's crazy. But yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, so
well, what you said,
please do that.
Oh, sorry.
Marcus, please follow that call. Like, we're all needed right now. We are all so very needed. Yeah. What were you gonna say, Brenda?
I was just saying that actually what both of you are talking about is my next, it was my next question, which was how can community health professionals stay engaged with this work and keep going with it? And I don't want to sidetrack the conversation we were having before with neurobiology.
Let's put it together.
Yeah, exactly. So
let's put it together.
We could start here and circle back to that, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, so particularly if we are successful, or when we are successful at defunding the police and creating equilibrium in our town's budget and our state's budget and our nation's budget, we spend money on the things that will keep us well. I just got shivers. Yeah, okay, we're gonna make it happen, y'all. It's gonna take a hot minute, but from being able to do that, or in order to be able to do that, the only tools that we're gonna have are our bodies. We won't, and as community healthcare workers, our tools have always only been our bodies. Our bodies and our words, whether they be spoken or written. Those are our weapons of mass construction, of revolution and evolution. Like, we've never been, I'm too excited and my words aren't coming out fast enough. I'm gonna calm down. So our bodies are going into the ring every day in a way, both through our own survivorship, the families we live in, the ancestral history we may carry, the communities we live in, and like, let's be real, a lot of organizations continue to replicate those power dynamics in our oppressive places to work because they're embedded in capitalism and colonialism and other practices. So pulling it back, if your body is your tool, then getting to know how it has survived and how it continues to be well every day, as well as it possibly can be, to be able to stay in the work, is our primary goal. And so one of the things around our neurobiology and those flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses is that each of those responses has a breath pattern and a muscular pattern of a way that we posture, hold tension, breathe in, breathe out. And like I said, because we're built for survival, we will tend to pop into those without recognizing that we do it, because we're so used to feeling it. Starting to feel other sensations in our body can get a little challenging sometimes, and we'll go into what it means to move into a trauma-sensitive relationship with yourself. So our work as community healthcare providers of any role that we take on is to practice breathing and moving in a way that keeps us in the other branch, or like, if we call it a felt sense of safety branch, or like our we're okay enough branch, our like rest, digest, ease, and connect branch, which is our parasympathetic branch of our autonomic nervous system. But we'll move there, and we can move there with every breath. Our nervous system is built to kind of have this healthy oscillation between like activating to be like, is something about to happen, to I'm good. Whoop, I'm ready. I'm good. And we're supposed to kind of like move back and forth between the two. What happens is that if we're pretty chronically exposed to a felt sense of threat because of the systems of oppression that we live in, we can get stuck in a breath that keeps us in our fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn response. So one of our major tools, because our breath is one of our major communicators to our nervous system, is to breathe in a way that helps you meet this very moment. So if this very moment is you sitting on the toilet going pee, or standing and pee, however you do it, then breathe to just pee. Don't breathe anticipating that like whatever happened 5 years ago might happen again, or, you know, breathing for that bill that's due in 2 weeks, or breathing for, you know, like breathe for here. But that also means that we need to be able to activate when we need to, and to find ease when we need to, and be in that like healthy oscillation. And we all need our own ways of doing that, because we all have different body constitutions. We all have different body sensations, and we all have different positionalities. So this is where choice comes in. The choices we make of how we breathe and how we move to be able to meet the present moment are 100% in the hands and then in the body of the individual survivor. What works for my body isn't necessarily going to work for Brenda's. What works for Brenda is not for Marcus, and vice, you know, and not for Lynn. But we might start to notice that we do some things that are kind of in common. But this is where choosing into moving and breathing in a way that feels supportive to your nervous system is absolutely imperative. And the more often we do that, the more we build up the neurochemicals that are necessary for neurological resilience. So this kind of comes into Lynn's question. So it is a conscious practice. Every single breath, every single ounce of water, every single type of food you ingest, and every single relationship and every single moment matters. And as often as we can engage in a breath and a movement pattern that helps our body go, I'm alive. Fucking A, I'm alive. Whether it's with a jump like that, or if it's like, I'm going to sleep because I just realized how tired I am. So tuning into our physical sensations and doing that often enough that we will always 100% respect if somebody else is doing it. That folks are going to be making choices for their own body, and empowering them to do so without us assigning from a position of power as a healthcare provider what they should do, but creating an opportunity for folks to be able to start to explore their own breath and their own movement from a place of agency and empowerment at a rhythm that helps start to create predictable rhythms of like being here. So taking care of our bodies, and like, I kind of want to write a comic. I swear this will make sense. I want to write a comic about the two villains of adrenaline and cortisol, and like how they wreak fucking havoc on our bodies, and the things that we can do to be able to like attend to that. So if your body is your main tool, your responsibility about its production of adrenaline and cortisol is one of the major responsibilities that we have to ethically engage in this practice of being a healthcare provider. Because when our brains and our bodies are hopped up on cortisol and adrenaline, we're so ineffective. We can't remember shit. We don't know, we can't feel our bodies. We say weird stuff, and we come up with wacky solutions that are driven by flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn. So keeping our body in check around purposely doing things that create different neurotransmitters, and I'm happy to kind of like break down what each of them do. But the other ones that we can purposely choose to try to create, and there's like provable ways that we can do it, are serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, our natural cannabinoids. These are all kind of like our like uplifting, whole body presence, euphoria, connection hormones. And there's ways that we can produce those on purpose. So similarly, every breath can help us go, we're fucked or we're okay. And every action can help us be like, okay, I'm gonna like stop the pump of adrenaline and cortisol, and I'm gonna kind of like pump up my other ones.
Right.
So we can't deny the mechanics of our body. And I think that kind of ties into like with what I would conclude for trauma sensitivity is that we need to be in like a trauma sensitive mechanical relationship with our body.
I love that. And can I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you said right now is perfect. And it also reminds us, just when we look at it on a community level, population level, that a lot of these high stress hormone levels contribute to other chronic diseases that we read about, that we've seen about. In fall quarter, you read about higher levels of low birth weight with Black women. And we have a program at Tacoma Pierce County Health Department that actually deals with that and acknowledges that the trauma of racism and trauma of other things that Black women go through causes that outcome because of the high stress hormone levels that are constantly raging in the body and causing a lot of physical, what we call physical or somatic effects, even though it's a emotional state and it's driven by our perception of the environment and our response as a survivor. So just to keep you in mind that what Morgan is saying is relevant to you as a provider, even if you go on to not do mental health and be a PA or a nurse or doctor, that acknowledging trauma is also looking at health problems and, you know, physical health through this survivor framework that you're talking about. And that's really important.
Incredibly. Yeah.
On that note, as both of you are talking, I'm listening very well. I'm just thinking, you know, I got a purpose and I got a desire, a passion to go out and help certain groups of clients or patients, however we're gonna look at it. But in that process, I'm already knowing from experience, from my education, that the systems I'm working in are broken, right? And I have had it out with my last director. He called me an advocate, an activist rather than an advocate, because, excuse my French, you're not gonna don't piss on my back and tell me it's raining outside. Okay, when I come across an issue that I know if we just do this here, this gonna work, but you're gonna tell me not to do it because now we're working outside of the mission or the mission statement or whatever, the ways we're supposed to do things. That's frustrating to me as a, you understand? So I'm already seeing myself getting into that fight or flight mode, and gonna be hard to breathe. And it's just like, what would you suggest going into? I mean, I'm not gonna go, I'm not gonna go get up right now and dressing all black and walk into a Ku Klux Klan meeting. You get what I'm saying? I'm just not gonna do that. I already know that's dangerous, right? But it's like going into an environment every day, and we already knowing it's broke, and I'm doing what I can for the person right there, but I'm already working in broken systems. That's what I'm struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
And Brenda, she kind of asked me about career paths down the road, and I had an answer for it. And it's the same reason.
Yeah. So may I reflect on something you're saying, Marcus?
By all means, please.
So inherently, anytime that we show up in the healthcare system, we are saying yes to being in relationship with trauma.
Okay, I like
We are
that.
saying yes to being in relationship with systems of oppression. We are signing up for a kind of combat zone, where we are like literally like sludging at each other with these big old like hits of unaddressed sexism, heteronormativity, racism, ableism within the very workplaces where we're supposed to be doing good. And then we are asked to be a part of the solution for the impacts of those same systems in the folks that we have the privilege of working with. So when we're talking about breath and body, like we're going at it every day. And so a lot of it, for me, what I've noticed is that I have to practice a practice of consent and invitation from my body. And like, this is what we're heading into. Like, how do you want to train to be able to make sure that you're saying a yes to it? Because anytime we ever force or coerce our own body into our work, we will no longer really be able to fully connect with what it feels like to do the work, because we'll start to numb out to the process, and then we'll get burnout, secondary trauma, all of that kind of jazz. So it does need to be a consensual practice of saying like, I am willing and I am knowingly interacting with violence, because our bodies are going to talk. Whatever your client's body is experiencing, you will co-experience with them once you get into 6 feet distance. And anytime you think about them and they're in a situation, you are co-experiencing in your body what it feels like to be them, in addition to what it feels like to be you. So we're co-feeling a lot, and our nervous systems are constantly talking. So we're also signing up for saying, I am willing and interested in being around folks who are in chronic flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses.
I've just always seen trauma-informed care from the client's perspective, making sure my tone of voice or my body language. I had situations where female clients came by and wanted some assistance, and a male approach, and it's like a trigger. Something got triggered, and they felt better talking to female providers because of experiences they had. So I always looked at trauma from that perspective. The way you breaking it down to me in my own sense, that's what I've been missing. And that's probably why Brenda wanted me to do meditation. Thank you, Brenda.
And meditation is one form in which we get to be in like sort of that healthful oscillation of our nervous system. And there's lots of different ways. Each one of us is going to be able to like find our own rhythm with it. And what it does offer us is that kind of like one of the things that meditations offers. And we can do this in a lot of different ways, but like being able to breathe to meet the moment. And our nervous system is just like any other part of our body. The more we effectively use it, the more it's going to be there for us. So we do have a lot of influence about being able to show up to our work from a place of connectedness and staying connected to our own body and staying connected to our full brain. Because when we're in our flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses, we have a hard time being able to connect to narrative memory, being able to remember things in linear order, the way that people like to hear them. That stuff gets interrupted when we're in our survival responses. Our sense of self, the way we feel ourselves and then know ourselves, gets interrupted and greatly influenced by our survival responses. So we get to know ourselves through our flight, fight, or freeze response. We get to know ourselves through not feeling our body. And then that then shapes our perception and also the way that we speak. So if we're in our survival responses, we'll speak from a place of fight, flight, freeze, submit, or fawn, mostly unknowingly if we feel a little uncomfortable or a little bit threatened or a lot of it threatened. So our responsibility is to being in our bodies in a way where we are as often as possible toning our nervous system to be here. So we can kind of like nervous system superheroes that like, no matter what's going down, we are as connected to this moment as possible, so that we're bringing our full nervous system online as much as possible. And then we get to be kind of like the catalysts in a room, because if everybody goes flight, fight, freeze in a room, and it can happen like that,
Yes.
folks aren't prepared to click out of it. on purpose and aren't training to do that, then the whole team will spiral.
Right.
And that's where like organizational patterns happen. So we got some talk to do in the next 20 minutes around apologies, around gender. You also want to find out some other things on policy and stuff. So like,
yeah, we have a lot going on. So what I think is if we'll hold back on any other questions from people who are here until the end, and we'll just focus on my last question and then other people who can't be here's question, because I know a number of people were dying to be here for this conversation and had to be at work or do other things. So I want to make sure their questions are at least touched on for a second. But I'll go with my last question first, which was, you had mentioned defund for a second, and that is something that we'll be discussing more in our final project, which, just to speak about Seattle, they've, for the rest of the fiscal year, defunded 50% of their police budget and have an intention of putting it into community health, rather than saying no one's going to be there when you call 911. That's not what they're doing, but they're talking about putting those dollars into actual community wellness and protection through other means that that are responding to society as we have it now, instead of when the police system was created, which was a different time and different norms were and systems of oppression were okay then, or dominating then, which we're not okay with anymore. And so as far as when you talk about that, what policies would you like to see in Tacoma or in the state or in the country, and what would you put that money into, or how do you see that happening in your ideal world?
oh my gosh. This is so rad. I'm so grateful that I was born when I was born and that I've chosen to do what I've gotten to do. This is such a fucking exhilarating time to be alive on, like, what side of history were you gonna land on? So I think one of the things that I know needs to happen is like a series of like demolition of certain systems and a series of construction of others and a series of maintaining certain ones. And so my focus, at least the choices I've made as a professional, is to focus on the places where the structure will probably stay maintained, but a lot of internal change has to happen. So I don't, shoving money towards healthcare as it's constructed right now will probably not solve our problems. But shoveling money towards healthcare for the restoration of the healthcare system, of increasing like folks' exposure to the implications of trauma on our bodies and our brains and our relationships in schools, in public health spheres, in community mental health, that my hope that funding could get moved towards that kind of really potent education so that we can understand this moment and make conscious choices in it rather than reactive ones to just shove money somewhere. And some of those conscious choices that I would really like to see are increased funding to POC-led organizations that have historically always been of service within communities of color, and that we follow their leadership because they've been working the hardest for the longest. And so I want to like financially invert the system as well in that way. And
I guess, can I interrupt you for a second? Yeah. To like, that was maybe too broad of a question, but I guess in Seattle, they're taking away money from police and putting it into health. And so like, what work do you feel that the police are overburdened with at this time that would be better done by social workers or health caregivers, and framing it in that way, because this movement is not about demonizing all police officers, especially those who are doing good work, but rather taking the burden of healthcare, which they're not trained to do, and it's not fair to put on them, and giving that over to people who are trauma informed and who are learning about that, active in that, practicing that, educators in that. And so maybe if it could get more even specific of what jobs should be done by mental health providers that aren't right now.
And I think that's kind of where my question was aiming to be specific, is that I don't think the way that we've been trained as social workers or mental health care providers or doctors or healthcare, we're not ready yet. Because the way we have been trained has been within the fucked up system. I'm just thinking about like my social work cohort, like I was the only one talking about trauma. And that was at UW in 2013. So like what I know about my co-professionals and a bunch of my friends who are like doctors of osteopathy, who are MDs, who are NDs, who might have learned about trauma, but we never got trained to what it means to be in physical proximity, especially the kind of physical proximity that we would need to be if we started to do things outside of an office and outside of the protection of the system of healthcare. That if we started to bridge that gap, we're not embodied enough, I think, to be able to tolerate that kind of intensity of work. So for me, my answer around getting funding in to be able to figure out what does it mean to be an embodied trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive caregiver and provider of services at this point, and how willing are you to put your body at risk to be more in community. And we're moving from like, we live in a very individualistic, I'm going to stay in my house in my pod. And what does it mean to be around bodies that you don't necessarily know, that might be moving and breathing and sounding and emoting and being a biological being when you're not necessarily used to being around that level of risk. And I think we got to train up. So that's what I was leaning towards.
Thank you. Yeah, I knew you were heading that way. I just didn't want to like put a huge question like that without some context. So thank you for sharing that. So it's like, if I were to summarize it, maybe training about trauma is somewhere
in relationship with it. Not just about it, but like, how do you relate with it? How does it feel in your body? How do you continue to show up? What makes you feel safe or unsafe? How can you, execute your own boundaries? Because the social work, at least I'm speaking from my experience, like it's a career that has been very much informed by sexist expectations, a lot of like overgiving and emotional labor, like, and this like way of being that actually isn't sustainable. But I know we have some questions specifically about apology and gender. Which one do you want to start with?
Do you want me to review them, or do you have them down?
I have most of their, I'm going to try to combine them.
Sounds good.
Got them in here.
Yeah, you can start wherever you want to start.
Okay. Alrighty, so kind of leaning into maybe the conversations about intersectionality first. We'll talk about shame and blaming the survivor, and add in apology in there. I'm probably not going to be able to get to all of these, but I hope that at least something we've talked about will inform these inquiries. So intersectionality, when it comes to kind of like diving into paying attention to trauma, intersectionality as a framework helps us to be able to understand kind of how all the lines of our identity come together to be able to meet at a certain point in which we carry a certain positionality or an identity within a community that is at a varying level, at higher or lower risk based off of how much protection we experience from systems of oppression. So when we're talking about like sort of this like idea of like density of survivorship, that comes to being able to have a pretty keen understanding that the more systems of oppression you co-experience, the higher the likelihood that your body will be taken advantage of in different ways or violated in different ways. And so you can look across any sort of way in which you put together like how race and gender identity and body size and physical ability and neurological ability and all of those things and how they layer, and the more, and poverty and survivorship of colonialism and capitalism, how those layer up to create a higher potentiality that you'll be victimized. And so the denser the survivorship, the more that we've been, and when we've publicly carried a narrative that when I experience violence, it's my fault, the denser your positionality and survivorship is, probably the more you've heard that. So this is where we're like leaning into how our bodies have a felt sense of shame from our own survivorship. A lot of that comes into, if you want to take like a developmental lens about how our brains interpret our experience when we're little. If we experience threats to our existence through sexual assault, through community violence, through interpersonal violence, through neglect, lack of access to food and healthcare, all of those like really uncomfortable sensations that come along with that, those kind of confluencing types of violence. When we're little, we associate those sensations with I am bad, because that's the hardware that we've got in our brains. I feel shitty, thus I am shitty. And most of us get exposed to some level of threat early enough that that kind of becomes our narrative. And so then it's also met with this public narrative of like, oh, you shouldn't have gone to that party. Why did you even pick up his phone call? Like, why were you on that corner? And we get questioned because there's that idea that like the individual has some sort of control of systems that have power to victimize us because of our positionality. So those two narratives of the outside forces in our community that will question the survivor, mixed with the sensation that if I experience something bad, I am bad, those two can like multiply on each other like real quick. So, and the reason that systems of power perpetuate that is from the way in which we've survived through disassociating ourselves from somebody else's experience and othering it. Because if I was to actually say, oh my God, it's not your fault, the whole world's unsafe, I have to feel that lack of safety that your body just felt. When we do that, when we get to that place of co-understanding how like vulnerable we really are, and particularly how our vulnerabilities multiply because of who we might be and how our body shows up in the world, we have to dig deep into a really like a felt sense of like, whoa, lack of like safety is not assured to anybody. Unless you are protected by systems of power that cause violence. And is that really being safe? I don't know. So when we bust open that like survivorship is universal, we all experience it in different ways, that nobody is really protected from being hurt, then we can like, I think it gives us a deeper sense of empathy to be able to make those kinds of apologies that we need to. And it also busts us open on presumed ideas of who the perpetrators are and who the survivors are. And making sure that we will trust anybody really when they say, I've survived this kind of violence, rather than being like, no, you're too smart for that. Now that doesn't happen to people that have your gender expression. So when we flip it to like that anybody can perpetrate and anybody can survive, then we'll be able to be in more authentic relationship with folks when they come forward with our experience, and we won't push back, reject, deny, or silence somebody's felt authentic experience of their survivorship. So and when shame is kept inside the body, because of the ways that we've been silenced because of our survivorship, it is one of those physical sensations. Shame is a physical sensation of like, that we then have a narrative of that we shouldn't feel. And it keeps on going from that, like, I feel like shit, I shouldn't feel that, I'm bad, like cycle that goes that happens. Our muscles will pattern in kind of those ways that will keep us in our flight, fight, freeze, submit, or fawn responses as well. So if we can interact with shame as a body sensation that I have agency in shifting, it's a lot easier than trying to shift the ideas that are continually getting information from our body that I'm uncomfortable. And so then our brain goes, I'm bad. I'm uncomfortable, I'm bad. I feel like shit, I'm bad. Where we can start to shift here, because most of our systems, like I said, are like about 85% body to our brain around how well or unwell we feel each moment. That when we start to shift our experience within our body, those thoughts start to shift too, and our concept of self shifts, and our concept of others shifts. So an apology, a really valid apology, gets to the depth of the feeling of the survivorship. I need to be able to show you through my body language, through my breath rhythm, through the words that I use, and the time that I spend, to be able to say my body gets what your body went through to the best of my fucking capacity, even though I'm not in your body. But I will do my very best to understand the depth of the thing you've gone through. And if I have been somehow contributing to that, then these are the overt actions that I am going to invest in to try to make sure that you don't have that experience again. I cannot control the world, and I cannot make you 100% safe, but I will promise you that I'm going to try to be the safest person around you that I can be. And advocate for your safety if I have access to. There we go. I think I tried to do as many of the questions as possible.
That was an awesome apology. I want to remember that. Yeah, thank you so much. 2 more minutes. I guess, yeah, most of them were answered, so I really, really appreciate that. And there was a question about whether there's more sexual trauma perpetrated on LGBT community or something to that effect that Kylie asked. And I think that's a big topic. That's probably another discussion or a whole class about that. But if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah. And that's tied into like where our density of survivorship is. So if we're surviving homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia in the way that we show up in the world, and I'm including myself in this, then I'm going to be hit with that system of oppression. And I'm going to be trying to figure out how to survive it. How out can I be? How queer can I express myself? Are you safe, unsafe? Depending on who I'm partnered with, I'll be viewed as a safe couple versus not because of how our bodies show up. And so when we're perceived as unsafe because of these systems of phobias and isms, we have a greater likelihood of getting hurt. So that's what I was talking about. Like the higher the density of your survivorship, the more likely you'll be victimized. So whatever that might be, because where your family's from, because the accent you have, because of the color of your skin, however the systems of violence play out, the more you co-experience, the higher the likelihood that you'll get hurt. That's what I mean by density of survivorship. There was this interesting question around gender neutrality and research and things like that too. And this plays into like releasing gender expectation around who the perpetrators are or not. Like most of my perpetrators have been in like assigned female at birth, but they have downloaded patriarchy and misogyny around how they can be around my body. So it's not necessarily that the systems are embedded in just certain types of bodies. They're embedded in all of us, and we all need to be conscious on whether or not I'm like playing out those unhelpful power dynamics. And as far as like gender neutrality, like we all have a pretty solid idea of our gender identity by the time we're about 6. And we all have a pretty solid idea of our gender identity when we're about, or sexual identity when we're about 12, 13, 14. And so if you can create a space for your child between the ages of 0 to 6 for them to explore what it means to be them and to trust that they know when they actually know, and to not create a system in which what they show up as is not allowed, you will create a child with a brain with so much less shame. They won't ever feel like they have to hide or keep distance from you or be silenced in your home. So if you want to raise a kid without shame, pronouns, let them pick. How they dress, let them pick. Who they feel safe around, they will tell you. They will know, they will show you with their bodies. So validating their experience, because little babies, they are just like pristine systems that pick up on things so well. Yeah, so that'd be one way that you could decrease the possibility of raising a kid with a brain of shame. So.
Thank you. That was awesome. I feel like that was a really good, I mean, I would love to go on, but we really appreciate your time. And my request is, if you're doing any trainings, like keep us in the loop of opportunities that come up with you. And thank you for sharing all of this and your own experience and your work. And we're super grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. I will, if you want to keep track of me, I'll put it in the chat. My website is under construction and it'll change shortly. It's a very old version, but it will stay the same URL. I'm doing an online training in a specific modality called trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga online in September. Definitely hit me up for student rates or work exchange or however you might want to be involved in that. That'll be on Zoom. So, and I consistently do those in the community. So I'm around. It was really great to spend time with you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very
much. And I can
much.
stay on for a little while, Brenda, if you want to debrief or anything.
Sure, that sounds good. Thank you everyone for joining who were here today, especially, and those who couldn't make it. We missed you. And I'll stop the recording here and have a great week.
All right. Thank you. You all be safe out there.
Stay safe, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.